Hi, everyone, and welcome to this live conversation with artist Lori Blondeau. My name is Renata Azevedo Moreira, and I'm an assistant curator here at the Indigenous and Canadian Art Department at the Art Gallery of Ontario. I'd like to start by acknowledging that the AGO is situated on Mississauga and Anishinaabe territory, which has been shared with the Haudenosaunee and Wendat and governed by Toronto Purchase Treaty 13 of 1805 between the British Crown and the Mississaugas. The Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe confederacies to share and protect the resources around the Great Lakes. Lori Blondeau, who I'm very happy to introduce, is joining us from Winnipeg, which is situated in Treaty 1 territory, the lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Dakota, Dene, and Noji Cree nations, and also the heartland of the Métis people. Lori is Cree, Saulteaux Métis from Saskatchewan. Since the 1990s, her artistic practice in the fields of performance, photography, and installation, along with her curatorial work and activities as co-founder and executive director of the Indigenous Art Collective Tribe, has proved decisive to the ever-increasing centrality of Indigenous art production in Canada. With her performances and photographic work, her practice, both as a solo artist and in collaboration with fellow visual artists, demonstrates a clarity of focus, which is remarkable for its precision, humor, and strength. Since 2018, Lori has been assistant professor of Indigenous art at the University of Manitoba School of Art. She was a recipient of the 2021 Governor General's Award in Visual and Media Arts, which is one of the most prestigious awards offered by the Canadian government. Thank you for being here, Lori.
Thank you for having me. You make me sound so good.
We will start this talk by showing a video of Lori's most recent solo exhibition titled I'm Not Your Kind of Princess, held from March to July 2021 at Plug-in Institute for Contemporary Art in Winnipeg. The show is curated by Nazrim Hamada, and the video was shot and edited by Lena Brown. Please feel free to write down questions in the chat or in the Q&A box throughout the sessions, and we'll have some time in the end where Lori can answer them. I also want to give our audience a trigger warning. Some of the Indigenous words used in Lori's practice and artwork titles might be considered offensive or derogatory in non-Indigenous contexts, and she will be talking more about that during our conversation. We can play the video now.
2 p.m. that day, she went to the hospital. She went to the hospital. She was scared. She's never felt this kind of pain before. She didn't know if she could do it. The pains were getting stronger and stronger. At 4:10 p.m., she was born. At 2 p.m. that day, she went to the hospital. At 4:10 p.m.,
Well, thank you so much, the colleagues from Plugin, for generously allowing us to show this video, which is quite touching. And I wish I had been in that exhibition, which is a survey of your career in a way. What do you feel, Lori? I wonder. seeing this video?
I think it's really well done. I was just my only concern with it is the audio, because there's one part where it sounds like I'm Mickey Mouse talking. Like, I don't know if it's because they've sped up the video or why, but I like it. I think it's a great document to have, as an artist and as documentation of a show. And it's I think it animates it in a way that you don't get from stills. So
yeah, for sure. Okay, so Lori, I want to start our conversation with the work that is currently being installed at the AGO, at the McLean Center for Indigenous Art here, and it's looking great. We did a photo, a picture of it, and of the actual work installed right now. And from this weekend, so from Saturday, visitors are going to be able to see this work in person. So this is the work that we acquired in 2020, last year, Lonely Surfer Squaw. And I want to start with it because it's such an iconic work by Lori, and it's one of the most important of her career. I think that she'll agree with me. And, I think, Lori, that it would be interesting to know more about your personas, right? The Belle Sauvage and Cosmo Squaw, Lonely Surfer Squaw. And it's so interesting because, it's a performative photograph, right? So we look at this image and I see the exact opposite of what popular culture imagines a surfer to be. So you're wearing a buffalo skin bikini and boots, and you're in this white and cold north, in opposite to the California sandy, sunny beaches. And she is misplaced, but at the same in this landscape, but at the same time, she seems perfectly fine and comfortable, really owning it and who she is and what she wants. So I wonder if you could speak to us a little bit more about this work.
This work came out of a curatorial project I had been invited to do, and it was in 1997 or 96. It must be 97 because it was shot in 97. For MAWA, which is an arts organization here in Winnipeg, mentoring artists for women's arts. And it was a web project. And in 1997, I don't even know if I had email back then. I probably did. But, I didn't know much about the internet, and it was called Postcards from a Feminist Utopia. And it was a group of 7 artists. So I was just kind of racked my brain about what to do for this web project that I knew nothing about the internet. And so, the term surfing the web was always coming up. And I collect old postcards, and I have this one postcard, I think it's from the 50s, late 50s, of the Lonely Surfer, which was, it was just a famous postcard of the Lonely Surfer. And so I thought, I want to be the Lonely Surfer. And so I just thought about where I lived, and it was in the winter time. And I, just asked myself questions like, okay, if you could surf here in the prairies, where would you surf? Well, the South Saskatchewan River. When would you surf? Probably the winter. And it was, it was taking sort of this icon of a white woman and inserting myself into that, and trying to undo the stereotype of the Indigenous woman, but also playing with the hybrid of that. And the bikini actually is made out of fun fur. But now I have a beaver skin bikini, which somebody gave to me after I had done this project for MAWA. And it became postcards too. So those postcards are still floating around. And then because I had 2 years or a year earlier had done the Cosmos Squaw and was developing the performance for her, because it was, I didn't do the performance for Cosmos Squaw right away. And I just thought, the Lonely Surfer is the Cosmos Squaw, and then I came up with a whole bio for Betty Daybird that, she made bad bee surfing movies. She rode with the only gay Wild West show in North America. Her grandmother did. That's Belle Sauvage. What else did I have in her bio? I have it somewhere. I haven't read it in so long. So it was just a progression, I think, to integrate her into Betty Daybird's persona. And so that's how the Lonely Surfer came about.
Right. And could you tell us a little bit more about the use of the word squaw?
I grew up in Saskatchewan till I was 8. I was in Lebret, which is in the Qu'Appelle Valley, where my father's family come from. And it's a huge Métis. There was a Métis farm that was set up there probably the time of the Treaty 4 was signed. And then I moved to Regina when I was 8 years old. And Regina being, this is in the early 70s, and it being pretty racist city, and still is. I grew up being called, a dirty squaw, an ugly squaw. So I think when I got older and making art was an avenue for me to deal with this derogatory word that I grew up with. And also being faced with being called that. I remember when I was 16 and I got called that at a park where a bunch of teenagers would hang out, and I made my friends take me home because I was really upset, because when you're 16 you just feel vulnerable. And my grandparents were in the city from the reserve, and my grandmother is Cree and my grandfather was Soto. So she asked me what was wrong, and I told her, and she said, you are a squaw. It just means woman. Don't let those racist people make you feel bad for something they don't even know what it means. And, and it just was the first time I had to really think about what the word means. Like in Cree, you say iskwe. But I ended up doing research around the word and because I figured it must have come from an Indigenous language somewhere. And so I did a bunch of research, and sort of where I think it might have originated is in Virginia, but from one tribe, it says it originated, that I found, it said the Rappahannock people, which is East Coast. And then I kind of stopped doing the research. But it makes sense that it would, come from the East, because that would have been some of the first Indigenous people that, that the settlers had come in contact with, and probably picked up the word, and probably just began as, woman, how to refer to Indigenous women, and then I think it just became bastardized, the more resistance that First Nation people had to the colonizers, and, became derogatory, and racism and all that, comes to the forefront of, when, they just thought they would come and we would be, lay down and allow them to just destroy us, and that's not what happened. So, and in the process of colonization, racism and other things happened to Indigenous people to put us down and make us feel as less to the colonizers. So that's, and I'm not going to say I want to reclaim the word, because I don't think we should have to reclaim words that have come out of our own languages. So I just wanted to turn the word around and make it what it means, which is woman. And then when I put it with cosmos, which means one within the universe. So I believe all Indigenous women are that. We come from the stars. So.
Wow, that's beautiful.
Yeah, that's the thought behind it.
Thanks for sharing that story, Lori. I can only imagine as a 16-year-old, we just absorb everything that is in our environment, right? And that must have been super impactful. And while you were speaking, I was thinking about our previous conversation in preparation for this talk, where we talked a little bit about your use of stereotypes, right? And how you reverse the stereotype through satire, because I think that's what you do with these personas that are parts of you, I imagine, but also you expand yourself on them creatively, right? And then this gesture of reversing the power with stereotype, it brings a shifting power dynamics to this work. And I remember you talked about power, and I wanted to understand better, and our audience to share with them what is the importance of playing with power and shifting the power dynamics in your practice.
I also not only grew up in racist Regina, it's way better than when I was a kid. I don't want people to think that Regina is this horrible place, but I also grew up watching a lot of movies in the 60s and 70s and the Hollywood, like the surfer movies, and just you never saw any Indigenous women or people in these films, and I just loved the films, right? And I think that influenced me too. Like, it's sort of like unpacking the stereotype of Indigenous women, but then inserting a hybrid into popular culture. And I guess that comes from watching bad B movies. And for me, it's powerful in the way that it undoes, because we're still being stereotyped. Images of us are still used. With Halloween coming up, I'm sure there's going to be Indian princess outfits out there in the store. So it's just challenging the viewer to see Indigenous women in a different light. And I think it's shifting the power of how they see us, because they all, I think people always think they know Indigenous people, but they only know what they see in the news, or if they're involved or an ally. So I hope that it shifts the power dynamic in a way that it undoes what they think of us in a stereotype, or their preconceived notions of who we are as people.
Yeah, a little of what, it's the same logic to me as what you were saying about the word squad, right? They are the ignorance who are calling you a name that they don't understand, because you understand and it's not derogatory.
Yeah, exactly. And then there's, when I made the piece, there was like the Cosmos Squaw piece. I remember having big discussions with different friends of mine and artist friends. Like, I remember talking to Shelley Nero about it, and she said it just meant something so ugly to her when she grew up, which it did to me too. Like, but I think my grandmother empowered me by telling me, like, don't let them they don't even know what it means. And it empowered me, because the next time I got called it, I was just like, yeah, I'm a squaw. You have a problem with it? Like, and that really, I remember that time so clear in my head, when the second time, or like the next time I had been called it, after my grandmother had talked to me about it. And I remember the guy calling me that, like, he swore and said I was a dirty squaw. And I just confronted him, and it ended up making him, like, he just didn't know what to do. Like, it totally, like, he just shrunk to this big, and he walked away, because he probably had never had that, happen to him when he was blurting out those racist slurs to Indigenous women.
Yeah. As we're talking about your grandmother, I wanted to jump to your last installation, right? The stones from my Kokum's house. Am I pronouncing it well?
Mm-hmm.
And I remember in our conversation, you said that stones are called, your community calls the stones grandfathers. Mm-hmm. And then I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about this most recent work of yours at Plugin. That was this installation, and what's the story behind it?
Well, my show with Plugin was being planned. I think I was asked to do it like maybe 2.5 years before it happened. And then, so I was kind of starting to plan it maybe 18 months before, or I think it was 18 months before, and then COVID hit. And so it totally changed it didn't totally change it, but things changed in the installation of what I was going to do. Like, I knew I was going to use rocks. I knew I was going to have an audio piece, but the rest, like the green curtains and the flags, were inspired by COVID. And I was in Australia with Wanda Nana Bush and her conference, Abaquois. And then, we all came back, and we had to self-isolate, and the whole world changed that day in March. And I ended up, because I had to stay home for 14 days, and I live alone, I ended up watching all this news, and I ended up like even getting CNN and all these news channels. But then our government started doing, the provincial government here, and same with, the federal government started doing news conferences to give like the report, to make, citizens probably feel a bit better that things might be a little under control. And
little did they know.
Yeah. And our premier here at the time, Palliser, he and the main doctor, would have these press conferences with these, awful kind of royal, it's not really royal green, but I think that's what it's supposed to be, is royal green, curtains behind them with flags. And so that kind of inspired the flags and the curtains. And then last summer, not this summer that we just went through, but the summer before that, I did my first visit back home to visit my mother on the reserve on George Gordon First Nation. And we went out to where she grew up, because when she was born in 1933, so when she was born, like houses used to be set way back away from the main road on most reserves in Saskatchewan, because they didn't want people, and far away from each other, because they didn't want people getting together. And the place where my grandfather chose to build their house is on this really beautiful kind of high It's not a hill, but it's a high point because it's prairies, right? And you can see really far. Probably, I don't know, you can see Regina from there, and that's about an hour and 15 minutes away. And it's also the Carlton Trail, which was a major trail route on the prairies that went through this land. And it was also a place where probably my great grandparents, because they would have been living in teepees, there was a camp there, so there was teepee rings there, and that's why my grandfather, I think, wanted to be there. And so growing up, we used to, they had already moved to a different house by the time I grew up, so their house still existed, but we would go out there in the summertime once a year to go camp and just have a barbecue and stuff. And then somebody burnt down their house because it was just a little sod house, small house, but the foundation was still there when we went this summer. There was flower beds my grandmother had made with rocks, and I asked my mom, can I take a rock home because I collect rocks? And, and the rock was quite big, my brother had to dig it out with I don't know how he got it out. He got it out, and I drove it back to Winnipeg. And so that was the inspiration for the name of the work. And so for me, the rocks in that installation are giving like a press conference. And it's because I look at rocks and was brought up to look at rocks as, we have our sacred rocks, which are our medicine wheels and our buffalo stones, but there's also rocks were used so much in the Plains tribes in our living, right? We use them to hold down our teepees. We use them to record our history through rock art. We use them for ceremonies. So, rocks are just a huge part of who we are as a people. And so I look at them as history holders, like they hold our history. And, and so many of our sacred rocks have been, destroyed. Like Azevedo, the work where I'm wrapped in red and on the rock, that's about a stone that was blown up in 1966 to make way for Lake Diefenbaker, because they were damming the South Saskatchewan River, and they were going to flood another place where the Cree, the Soto, the Cree, Soto, Assiniboine people all would have huge gatherings in this kind of valley, and ceremony, because this buffalo stone was there, and people right up to the day that they blew it up were still doing ceremony around this rock, which was huge, a really huge rock, like 17 feet high, and I can't remember how large it was, its diameter. And there was protests going on, like a man, Buffy St. Marie, I think, did a protest, and Wilfred Tutusis, who was an elder from Treaty 6 in Saskatchewan, he also tried to save the rock. And they ended up blowing it up in the middle of the night. And part of that, my Azevedo, there's one, they saved a shard of the rock. And one of the photographs, I am standing on that shard, which sits at the marina of Elbow. And it's called Elbow because that's where the river used to, the South Saskatchewan and the Assiniboine River meet. But because Lake Diefenbaker is there now. It's a lake and a marina, and they have it there, and they have two cairns with plaques on it that describe the rock, one in Cree and one in English, and it just talks about the blowing it up and what happened to the rock. So
do you feel like the memories that the rocks carry die with them when they're described?
no, because standing on that rock was, I could feel it through my feet. You know, I didn't have shoes on. No.
Right.
No, but you know, it's not being used for the purpose of what our people had it for. You know, people, I think people probably go out there and maybe do a visit to it, but I don't, you know, and that's ceremony in itself, because it still has its, like, you can feel it. Yeah.
Yeah. When we're talking about ceremony, right? I think that a big part of your work is about ceremony and rituals or practices that your community, your ancestors have and have had. And I remember reading somewhere a phrase that James Luna, your longtime friend and mentor, said that performance art is the only art form that allows Indigenous artists to say what you want to say without compromising who you are. And I think it's a very powerful statement. And I was thinking about a ceremonial performance such as Sisters, a work from 2002, where you crush Saskatoon berries, you gut a fish, and you tear a cloth into strips in the performance. And I wanted to ask you if one of the reasons that you do performance is to learn the traditional skills that perhaps you didn't learn growing up in the city.
I grew up watching some of my aunts and people, like when I would go to ceremony, I saw stuff going on, but, I was a girl, and I just, when you're a kid, you just don't, it's just things that happens when you're in different ceremonies that we have. And so growing up, becoming an adult and becoming a performance artist, I wanted to make a piece that was about sustenance and how fast our way of eating on the plains had changed. Because I was thinking about, like, wow, we have these problems with diabetes, we have these problems with obesity, and our bodies just weren't built, and we don't have to be eating, McDonald's and all this fast food and crappy food. And I was thinking about that, and it's because, you got to remember the bison were killed off like within 2 years, and our people were starving. So we also come from, that trauma of having, like, my mom remembers them starving because they weren't allowed to kill their cows because the farm agent, it was against the law. And they would have to do it in secret. When I was there for Turkey Day, I like to call it. She told me a story she remembers when she was a little girl, that they were starving because they would get their food from the Indian agent, or it was called a farm agent. And and he was, nobody liked him. Even the settlers around the reserve, that bartering would go on with some of, like, my grandfather used to barter with them, but they would have to do it in secret because it wasn't allowed, but even, which were a lot of Ukrainian and Polish people and German people, but they hated the Indian agent. So she told me a story about remembering when she was a kid and they decided, just a few families, to kill one of my grandfather's cows.
Oh.
So they shot it, and then they dragged it and had to go bury it, like put it in the bush and cover it up, because they knew the farm agent was going to come. And sure enough, the RCMP, I think, showed up and said, "Oh, did you guys hear a shot?" And everybody said, "No, no." Or somebody said somebody's gun went off or something, had to lie about it, because if they would have found the cow, somebody would have got laid charges against, and they probably would have taken the cow away. But she said it fed so many people.
This was what year, what decade, more or less?
I think she said she was about 6, so she was born, so 1939, maybe even younger. Yeah, so in the 30s. Yeah. So so that's where Sisters comes from, is just wanting to talk about, because after I crush the berries, I gut the fish, I rip the cloth, then I eat 14 McDonald's cheeseburgers to the song Hello Dolly. So yeah.
Right. And you were telling this story about going back home for Turkey Day and listening to a new story that you hadn't heard before from your Kokum, from your grandmother.
No, from my mother. My Kokum's dead.
Oh, right. Sorry.
My Kokum would have been 106 this year if she was still.
Oh, wow. Okay. So from your mom. And I was thinking about the importance of storytelling in your practice. And I remember reading in a magazine that you would about the bingo culture in your family, and that your family would go to bingos. And I remember you saying that you went just for the stories, because you go to places and then that's where the stories happen, and just to listen to the stories. And you often describe yourself as a high-tech storyteller, maybe to use the words of James Luna. And I was wondering, what does that mean to you? Is it about the presence of the technology, or is it about something else? So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Maybe I can say a little story. So James Luna was at the San Francisco Film Festival, and he was giving a talk, and there was an elder also going to be giving a talk. And when he went and sat down beside her, she goes, "You're a high-tech storyteller." And so that's where he got the phrase from. And and I remember asking him, like, I curated a festival called High Tech Storytellers. And that was the first time I asked him if I can use the term. And he goes, "Oh yeah, like, I don't own it." And that's when he told me the story about where that phrase came from. And how I see that is, because we're living in this time of technology. And, it's not like our stories in the plains would be told during the winter months, because, we would be in our teepees, especially if we stayed up north, like because we would go down further south if we didn't get a good buffalo kill, because, staying more north, it's colder. So just traveling down to, a little ways down into the States, it's warmer. So, so our stories would be told in the winter in the teepees, that's when the stories would be told. And so we now tell the stories, but in a different way. It's just a continuum of what has gone on for millennia in our culture. So that's how me and James had huge conversations about being high-tech storytellers and where how we viewed it as artists. So
Yeah. Well, I don't see questions in the chat, so I'm gonna make another question.
okay.
You were telling me that your work is a lot about nostalgia too, as well as, of course, it's a political work that tells a lot about trauma too, a trauma that is, I suspect, both personal and from our community. And I'm thinking about the performance "Are You My Mother" from 2000 that you performed again earlier this year at the Winnipeg Art Gallery online, and it's still online. And I really recommend everyone to Google it and go there, see it, because it's a very, very powerful and heartbreaking piece. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about this performance in particular.
This piece, my mom always says, you know, if times were different, she would have become an artist because she's very, very talented. And so she always sort of would help me with different costumes. She's a great seamstress. And so we would make costumes together. She was very involved in a lot of my practice. And when she told me the story about when she went to residential school in the late 30s, she would have went. And when she first went to George Gordon First Nation residential school, which was the last school to close down in Canada in 1996. And she only went there for a year, and that was run by the Anglicans. And then my grandfather converted the family to Catholic. Maybe she went for 2 years, because then her sister, who's 2 years younger, started there, and he converted them because they were starving. The Anglicans had no money. And so he could send them to this other residential school, which the Catholics ran, and that's in Muskowgon. And it's called it has the the Mission School, I think it was called. It's one of the schools they found 35 kids buried on. So this story was about her residential school experience. And when she told me the story, I just thought there was some just beautiful kind of visuals to it. And so that's when I asked her, like, can I make your story into a performance art piece, along with, I said, you know, some of my own, like the original Are You My Mother had my own stories in there too.
All right.
And so her story is just about how she couldn't stand the smell of the school. My grandmother, or Kokum, had a hard time going to see her kids in residential school, which I can understand. Like, that must have been heart-wrenching. You know, your kids, just, you have to take them there or else you go to jail, you know. And
the heartbreaking part about the fence, right?
Yeah, and so my great-grandparents used to go visit my mom and my aunt. And when they would go visit, like, it would be a full day on horse and cart, because, you know, they didn't have cars. And so they would go there, visit with them, but they weren't allowed physical contact. So they would have to visit through this fence. And my great Kokum would bring like a blanket for the girls to sit on, and she would set up one for her and my great grandfather, and then they would just have tea and bannock. And my mom would ask her before they were leaving to throw her sweater over because she I don't want to walk out this.
Take your time.
Sorry, it's just a hard
Yeah.
thing to talk about. Yeah, so because she hated the smell of the residential school, and the sweater smelled like home, and home would have been the smell of what they burned in the wood stoves, which would have been popular, and it has a very specific smell. And so that's where that's sort of what inspired the piece.
Yeah. Well, it's very beautiful.
Oh, thank you. And the first time I did it was for my MFA graduating exhibition, and my mother was there, and she worked on the piece with me for 2 years. And then when I said, "Are you sure you can be," because it also was in a very small space, and I actually skin poplar trees, and it gives off that smell. And so the smell actually triggered her during my performance, and she broke down, and I had to take her out of the gallery and take her in the back. And I said, "If you want me to stop, I'll stop." And she goes, "No, you should go finish." And so I went and finished, but it totally changed how I wanted to do the performance, because everybody who I was going to lock in this kind of pen area I had built were crying. And I thought, I can't do that. I can't. So it changed the whole piece. And then so jump up to 2018, when I remounted it for the show I had at the University of Saskatchewan at the College Art Gallery, I tweaked it, the piece, where it was just about my mother's story. And I recorded the story because I knew I'd have a hard time speaking it, because
the first time you were speaking it.
I was speaking it.
Right.
And then so, and I actually finally got to lock people in this pen when I did it at the College Art Gallery. But when I did it at the WAG, it was just for recording video. And that I didn't think was going to feel like a performance, because as a performance artist during this time of COVID, I've decided not to make performance for Zoom, or, it's just too weird for me. And Jamie Isaac had approached me to be a part of a show that just came down called Born in Power. And she asked me if I would remount that, but that we would, because I said, I'm not doing streaming online, or like live streaming online. I said, I don't want to do that. She goes, what if we just record you? Because we were in lockdown too when we recorded it. So, are just coming out of lockdown, but the galleries, I think, might have been still closed. So we shot it in the foyer of the Winnipeg Art Gallery, which is all tinder stone, which is a stone that's from here, from Manitoba. And there was the three people with the video company, and they were Indigenous women. And then my assistant, Annie Beach, and Jamie, who watched it. And it felt like a live performance, just having those women there. And so that felt good, because I hadn't done performance for a while. So
and when you watch the video, do you like it?
Yeah, I like it. I like the way it turned out. I think it works for what it is. And I think it's because it's only the time, a little over the time of the audio, which is 10 minutes. And I think that video goes for maybe 12 minutes. But the original piece, when I do the whole piece, it takes a half hour because there's other things that happen in it. So yeah.
Right. We have one question, and it's going to be our only question because we're almost ending. From Angela Montenti, she says, I think she's referring to stones from my Kokum's house. She says, please tell us the significance of the white flags, and particularly why the meaning of colored ribbons used in the flag.
I wanted a flag that was neutral. And my original idea was to screen print. There's some rock art that's in Saskatchewan where there's a turtle, a huge effigy of a man that has a penis, and you can see the rock formation, but you can't tell it's a man unless you're like in a plane or up on top of a ladder. And I was going to screen print not the turtle, that specific rock turtle, onto the flags. But then I just thought, in process, that's not going to, it didn't work for me. So and I wanted a flag that was I was trying to make my own flag. And so the white, I knew I was going to use white. The colors of the ribbons were people, all across North America, women wear ribbon skirts, we wear ribbon shirts, and work with a lot of ribbon. And instead of having, I can't remember the name of the cord that goes on a flag, I learned lots about flags. Instead of having that, I chose to put ribbons. There's no significance to the colors that I chose. I just liked how they looked and that they worked. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Awesome. Well, I think we are gonna close now. Lori, thank you so much for being here and sharing all the stories with us and talking about your art. It has been amazing, and we are looking forward to doing this again in a future opportunity. And I hope you'll be able to come see your piece installed at the AGO.
Yeah, I think I'm going to try come for. Will it be up when Robert Hoole's show opens?
Yes.
I want to come for Robert Hoole's opening. So
great. And
I'm sorry, everybody, for breaking down that. I don't know. I think I'm exhausted too. And, yeah. And talking about that piece is always hard for me. So,
I totally understand. Kathleen shared the link to the performance on the chat. So thank you so much, Kathleen. And okay, everyone, bye. It was awesome to have you here. Thank you for watching.
Thank you.